We are beginning our last series in the journal for 2016-2017. So this right near the back, if you're taking notes in your journal, you'll find the beginning of this new series. I'm launching it this morning. I'm then actually taking a couple of weeks vacation, so I'll not be around, but Bob and Adam and Tyson will be weighing in on the teaching in this series. So we hope that you're really going to enjoy it and gain a lot from this. One of the things you'll have noticed we've said quite a few times this year, is that our culture that we find ourselves in, particularly Western culture, has become quite obsessed with fame, with being seen and being perceived to be well known, to the extent that we're not overly bothered in Western society what you're well known for. Just simply being well known is the kind of thing that we are super excited. You might want to say it like this: fame doesn't need to have a lot of worth to it anymore. Just being famous is its own reward. The writer and an incredibly insightful person into issues of culture, and Daniel Boorstin, points out that the measure of a culture is often what it claims as significant. So there's a bit of a challenge to us in the contemporary society that we live in, that if we think fame is so significant, what does that actually say about us? What does it say about us, the sort of things that we fill our web pages and our newspapers and our TV shows with? It kind of reflects back on why do we think this is so valuable? Why do we think this is so important? But as we've been kind of reflecting on these sort of issues about why are some people considered famous and some not, the kind of question that hangs around there for a people of the church is actually a question like this: well, what does the Bible consider fame worthy? What does the Bible think about a person that makes them worth talking about? We've got used to just somebody being famous, and really sometimes we forget to even ask, why is that person the kind of person we're talking about? Whereas the Bible guides us towards some people and actually wants us to ask, why are they famous? Perhaps when you're reading the Bible, the question is, why is the Bible more interested in Moses than J-Lo? You know, why is it the Bible tells you what John the Baptist is wearing, but we find ourselves more interested in what Lady Gaga turned up with at the latest awards show? Although I sometimes wonder if Lady Gaga was to read the Bible, if she would turn up looking like John the Baptist somewhere. I don't know if that kind of camel skin and sort of honey beard would perhaps work. I'm not sure. The question for us as we read the Bible is perhaps Daniel Boorstin's question: what does the Bible think is significant? Why does it tell us about particular people in particular ways? What is it that these characters of the Bible have done that means their story is preserved? Hebrews chapter 11, and you may want to turn to that just as we're talking this morning, but Hebrews chapter 11 is a well-known passage within a well-known book of the Bible. And at chapter 11, the writer basically starts to chart out a story of significant characters from the biblical story. Significant characters in the Christian history at some level, you might want to say it like that. And the thing that defines them, the thing that gets you into the list in Hebrews chapter 11 is faith. If you have faith, you make it to this list. If your faith in God seems to be the defining characteristic of your life, then Hebrews chapter 11 wants to talk about you. Whereas we might be tempted to talk about someone based on the size of the thing they did, based on the accomplishments they achieved, Hebrews chapter 11 talks about people just simply on the basis of their faith and trust in God, regardless of their circumstances. So yes, it charts stories of Abraham and Joshua and Moses, but other characters like Rahab find themselves being mentioned in there. And the question that's always asked of these people is, were they acting in faith or not? And Hebrews confirms, yes, they are. Because these people, their significance was found in their common surrender to God. All of them said, what God wants of us is what we're prepared to do. And at risk to their own life, at risk to their own circumstances and their own situations, they follow God and do what he asked of them. Near the end of the chapter that we're talking about, right towards the end of chapter 11 at verse 32, you see the writer to the Hebrews, like many preachers the world over, start running out of time. He realizes he's taken too long to tell you about all these exciting characters at the start of his text that he starts running out of time. And what he then does is sort of starts to rush through a few other characters that he kind of knows his readers probably know. If you were a Jewish person or maybe a new Christian in the first century, you would have been taught about a lot of these characters quite early in your journey. So the writer to the Hebrews doesn't need to spend a lot of time on them, but he wants to mention them just to raise to your attention. Remember these incredible characters of faith. Our aim in this series, as we teach it over the next few weeks, is to look at some incredible characters of faith, people who did outrageous things for God, people who committed to do what God had called them to do, but perhaps we don't talk about that often. Perhaps over the last few years at Westside, we've not even mentioned some of these characters. Perhaps some of them you've never even heard of. And yet the Bible talks about them. Christian history talks about these characters because their faith is something that we can learn from. So the writer to the Hebrews says this, "And what more shall I say? I do not have time to tell about Gideon, Barak, Samson and Jephthah, about David and Samuel and the prophets, who through faith conquered kingdoms, administered justice and gained what was promised, who shut the mouths of lions, quenched the fury of the flames and escaped the edge of the sword, whose weakness was turned to strength and who became powerful in battle and routed foreign armies. Women received back their dead, raised to life again." What a great passage full of inspiring stories. Now, some of these you know about. It's hard to get through Sunday school in church and not be told about Gideon. We love that story in Sunday school. In fact, we love most stories in Sunday school that you can act out, right? So which is why even Samson, we love that story, David and Goliath. I think that's day one of children's church, right? David and Goliath, that's the one we're going to learn on day one. So every child knows about it. We're often a little foggier in the West Hall, but all of our children know about these stories. But then the writer does something where I can only assume this is a kind of like a Bible quiz for the ages, where the writer decides, so let's just start talking about Bible stories, but I'm not going to tell you who it was that does it. Let's see if you can guess. It's kind of like biblical Jeopardy. You know, yes, Jack, I'll take famous Bible characters for $500. In which case the question is, who shut the mouth of lions? I'm going to go with who is Daniel. Okay, you guys are kind of not sure. Not a lot of confidence there. Okay. What about who quenched the fury of the flames? Shadrach, Meshach. No, I was looking for their names in Hebrew. Sorry, you're out. These characters, Daniel was in a lion's den and an angel came down and closed the lion's mouth. I was trying to say it in Hebrew there, sorry. I wasn't really, my teeth just fell out. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they came along and they were thrown into a fiery furnace. Why were they thrown into a fiery furnace? Because they refused to bow to anyone other than God. And they find themselves in a fiery furnace. The Bible tells us an amazing story about how they find themselves in there and they weren't burned up. Instead, they were saved because God came through and rescued them. Some of the prophets found themselves threatened by sword, but they didn't. They managed to escape and were saved. There's a beautiful story that a lot of scholars think is maybe being referenced here, the story of Esther, who finds herself this woman who perceives herself as having no influence at all, but ends up being able to convince a king to save the whole Jewish people. The Bible story is full of people who routed the armies who came against the people of Israel. And then there's a wonderful little story in Elijah's life where a woman who was serving him and helping him survive and stay alive loses her son. And Elijah prays for the son and he's raised back to life again. Incredible stories of faith. People who were prepared to stand up for what God had called them to refuse to back down when following God was difficult. And God came through and made these remarkable stories. But then, at the end of verse 35, the story that the Hebrews writer is talking about starts to shift. And we end up with this sentence: there were others who were tortured, refusing to be released so that they might gain an even better resurrection. Some faced jeers and flogging and even chains and imprisonment. And then the writer drops into the account of the deaths of some people, which are very traditional sort of in the Jewish scriptures. They were put to death by stoning, they were sawed in two, they were killed by the sword. They went about in sheepskin and goatskins, destitute, persecuted, and mistreated. The world was not worthy of them. They wandered in deserts and mountains, living in caves and in the holes in the ground. You see, if you've been raised learning and hearing the stories of the Jewish prophets, these anonymous stories would actually start to reference to you. A lot of people traditionally understood that in the Jeremiah, the famous prophet Jeremiah, was put to death by stoning. Not the kind of exciting sort of end that you imagine for Jeremiah, I know the plans I have for you, says the Lord. Not quite what we were hoping for, as we slowly slide that verse off our fridge. Some of them were sawed in two. Tradition holds that the prophet Isaiah, I think you guys say something different, he was hiding out because he was being chased down by his enemies, and he hid in an old tree, and they found him in that tree and chopped him in half while he was still in the tree. We know that Elijah and Elisha went around in various goat skins and sheep skins. And all of these incredible prophets that we actually don't often hear about how their life ended. The Hebrews writer points out just to the pieces that we know through Jewish history of probably what happened to them. And then he throws in this line, the world was not worthy of them. These characters that trusted in God to the absolute end and actually cost them their life, the writer turns around and says, still, they're an example of faith to us. You see, sometimes we perceive faith as that which means everything works out okay in the end. Sometimes our idea of faith is that if it works out okay, that was good faith, and if it didn't work okay, that probably wasn't good faith. But the writer of the Hebrews throws all these stories in together and says all of these are example of people's faith and how they trusted in God in tough circumstances. I find myself fascinated by this little opening line, and I want to talk to you about it just this morning. In verse 35, it says, there were others who were tortured, refusing to be released so that they might gain an even better resurrection. If you were familiar with the stories of Israel, if you were familiar with the stories of Judaism when this text was written, that would have immediately drawn your mind to a story that's found in a book which we don't include in the Protestant canon of Scripture called 2nd Maccabees. The two Maccabees accounts are tellings of events that happened a little bit after the Old Testament and a little bit before Jesus was born. At a period in time where the kind of breakup of Alexander the Great's empire, which was taking over Europe, found it in such a way that a leader or a ruler called Antiochus Epiphanes IV turned up in Jerusalem and decided that he was going to conquer this city. And conquer the city they did. And at the very key moment, Antiochus Epiphanes, he walks into the Jewish temple, into the most holy spot, the Holy of Holies in the Jewish temple, and he sacrifices a pig there to his own God. Now imagine if you were a Jewish person at a time like that, right? Now, the sacred, most holy place of the temple is only for one particular person, the high priest, who has to come from one particular tribe. And he's only allowed to go there on one particular day at one exact moment and make the correct sacrifice to God on the behalf of all the people of Israel. To be a Jewish person, knowing that only a handful of people have ever been into that holy place, and to watch Antiochus Epiphanes, a non-Jewish leader, walk into that place and sacrifice a pig, because as we all know, Jewish religion doesn't permit the eating of pigs. So for that to be sacrificed in the most holy place, they had a name for this in Israel. They called it the abomination of desolations. It was the worst possible thing you could imagine seeing happen, was a pig be sacrificed by a pagan king in Jerusalem's most holy place. The story unfolds that this group, led by a family called the Maccabees, rose up and over the next 3 years fought against this emperor and eventually actually drove him out of Jerusalem. And they held this day of consecration where they rededicated the temple back to God. The day of dedication is what is now celebrated in the Jewish festival of Hanukkah, the festival where they brought the temple back and gave it back to God again. They restored it and cleansed it and purified it. And in 1 and 2 Maccabees, these two Jewish texts, they tell the story of how all of this happened. And right in the middle of the story of 2 Maccabees in chapter 7, there's an account of this family, this mother and her 7 sons, who are captured by the king, and the king decides to make a little bit of a spectacle of them. He wants to discredit them, and in doing so, kind of suck the energy out of the people of Israel. He wants to show them that they're a beaten people. So he brings this mother and her 7 sons in, and he basically says this to them, here, if you will eat this pork with me. Now, this is a huge challenge for Jewish people, because not only have they been in this place of oppression, they've seen terrible things happen in the temple, now they're being asked to eat pork. And not eating pork was a huge issue for Jewish people because that's the marker that they've separated themselves to God. One of the markers that says we're God's people. So where we see it as, hey, you're just being asked to eat a bit of pork, the Jewish person at the time of this story happening would have saw that as, are you going to step away from God's law and show that you're not God's people? One of the brothers turns to the king and says, what do you intend to ask and learn for us? For we are ready to die rather than transgress the law of our ancestors. They're faced with a challenge. Eat some pork and live, or follow God's law and die. At which point you become highly suspicious that this story didn't happen in Canada. Would you like a bacon sandwich? Yes, please. The end. But instead, these brothers, one after the other, I'm not going to put the whole of 2 Maccabees 7 on the screens because it's not in any way family friendly, but you can read it yourself in your own time if you want. But systematically, this king works his way through these brothers, one after the other. And as they watch, as one after the other, they are killed in various gruesome ways. And each one has the opportunity to say to the king, this question you're asking is a question about whether we're going to stay loyal to what God has asked of us or whether we're going to be disloyal. And all of the brothers have the same perspective. Their perspective seems to be that their life is definitely at threat, but the king's power is only over their life. And they follow a God who is eternal. And they follow a God who is bigger than their situation. And they seem to make their decisions not on the basis of what's best for me at this moment, but what has God called me to be. And the king keeps threatening them with death. And their constant answer is the same, but our fear is not the one who can kill us, but who we trust in and who we fear is the God who can raise us from the dead again. And in the face of believing that God can do anything, one after the other, they go to death. The seventh brother, the youngest of them, the king gets so frustrated by this, he actually offers him wealth and position in the government. He offers him all the sort of trappings of life and says, if you just eat this, you can have all this thing. And the brother refuses to sacrifice any one bit of his loyalty to God just in order to keep the king happy. They turn to the mother and try and get her to talk the brothers into good sense. And the mother comes away with some incredible perspective on this. In verse 20 of 2 Maccabees chapter 7, it says, the mother was especially admirable and worthy of honorable memory. Although she saw her 7 sons perish within a single day, she bore it with good courage because of her hope in the Lord. Her ability to trust in God, despite the devastating nature of the day she's suffering. The writer of this text says this was admirable, and we should always remember that she held to this. And she leans down to talk to one of her sons in the closing minutes of his life and says this, the creator of the world, who shaped the beginning of humankind and devised the origin of all things, will in his mercy give life and breath back to you again, since you now forget yourself for the sake of his laws. This mother brings this eternal perspective to a tragic moment in her life, and all of the sons and the mother herself are put to death. But this story sort of sparks something in the mind of the people that heard about it and saw it that says that we too should hold loyal to God's law. And this story is told in this account of the Maccabees because it starts to motivate other people to say we should stand up for what God has called us to be regardless of our surrounding circumstances. Now, you can't do that sort of thing if all you're worried about is your own life. If all you're concerned about is what happens to me, then you're eating the pork and living to fight another day. But this family, this young man, these 7 young men and this mother, their perspective was what God has called us to be is more important than our own lives. And that's perhaps why they find themselves unsung, perhaps, in that we don't hear about them very often, but they make it into this one line in Hebrews chapter 11, that they believed that they could face torture because they knew that God can always do something bigger, that God can even raise them from the dead. Now, this story is quite important to Christian history because as you read your way through the Maccabees, you'll start to see the development of the ideas that Jesus walked into, the ideas that God can raise the dead, the ideas that God can bring us back, that God's eternal plan is more important than just what's happening in your life at that exact moment. And also, as the New Testament sort of folds its way out, we see a perspective that actually happens in the lives of these young men that you see happen through the story of the New Testament and the planting of the early church. Essentially, they seem to ask a question. What's more important, our story or God's story? What's the story that's motivating you? What's the story that's making you decide the things that you decide in your life? How do you make decisions? How do you choose things? When you're faced with a challenge, when I'm faced with a challenge, when life gets difficult around us, what motivates the decisions we make? Are we motivated to do the thing that's right by ourselves? Are we motivated to do the thing that actually makes the most sense to us? For me, I find the question, how often do I try and find the easiest way to get out of the pit that I find myself in? That's often our natural intention, is to say, how do I get out of this mess? But these characters that we read throughout the Maccabean story and then also throughout the New Testament, they didn't seem to ask that question first. Their trust in God was such that it seems they regularly asked the question, what does God want of me in this situation? Rather than just, how do I get out of here? And that story arcs its way through a lot of the New Testament. But I want to jump over the New Testament just for a moment and take you into the early generations of the church. Right after the New Testament, you find this period of history where the Christians were heavily threatened by the Roman Empire. They were constantly being hounded out of their homes and chased down and persecuted and killed. The Roman emperors seemed to have a remarkably creative ability to think of new and different and more horrific ways to persecute and kill Christians. In the midst of that, there's a story of an old man called Polycarp. He is... And let me just say, when you're writing this in your journal, just try and spell that correctly. Unlike one of my students who got it a little bit wrong, unfortunately, in an essay at one point. So that's C-A-R-P and not the other way around. Polycarp was this fascinating old character who came along, and he is the Bishop of Smyrna. He's this huge sort of figure in early Christianity. One of the things that's really fascinating about Polycarp is tradition holds that he was actually a disciple of the Apostle John. When he was a very young man, he actually was discipled by the elderly Apostle John. Now, as far as teachers go, that's pretty neat. Can you imagine that? Like, that would be sort of pretty much the dream for most people. If you can be discipled by Jesus himself, what about being discipled by someone who was discipled by Jesus himself? This guy's telling stories about when Jesus did things, and it's actually because he was there and saw them happen, right? So this Polycarp, and we find him this incredible character of faith, and we can only assume that not only did he have a real experience of Jesus himself, but as he was learning from his teacher, as a disciple of John, he was guided in the way that Jesus would call someone to live. So Polycarp ends up a bishop, this hugely influential character in the sort of second generation of the church. But of course, he was living under a time of intense persecution. And the story goes that what happens is Polycarp finds himself captured, and he is sort of arrested and is facing execution. And he's sort of drawn into this horrible sort of impending doom of his life that all kind of focuses around whether or not he's going to be loyal to Jesus or not. Basically, what the Roman emperors were often doing in the time was they would bring Christians into arenas and ask them a series of different questions that would hopefully encourage these Christians at the face of death to sort of back down on their loyalty to Jesus. So they would sometimes ask them, hey, will you maybe deny Christ? And if they did, then they'd let them free. And if they didn't deny Christ, they would be executed. They would ask them to maybe confess the lordship of Caesar over the lordship of Jesus. And again, if you confess the lordship of Caesar, you live. If you don't, you die. Sometimes they would ask them to deny the other Christians who were there. And you find this quite often in the text, and it's quite a fascinating perspective. They were asked to deny the atheists, which always makes me chuckle, because basically Christians were referred to by the Romans in the first century as atheists. Which you might think, well, why would they refer to them as atheists? And basically the logic was the Romans believed in a lot of gods, and the Christians believed in only one God. So kind of on a parallel scale, if you believe in lots of gods and one group only believe in one God, they're a lot closer to atheists than you, right? So you would hear the Christians constantly referred to as atheists, and they would drag in Christians and say away with the atheists, say death to the atheists. And if you said any one of these things, you deny Jesus, you confess the lordship of Caesar, or you say away with the atheists, they would let you live. Simple words, little tiny words. and you could be set free. However, there's a little text which I have here with me called The Martyrdom of Polycarp, which as far as titles go, kind of gives away the way this story is going to go. And, so if you're hoping for a happy ending, don't bring, don't pick up a story that the title is The Martyrdom of. Right? And in this story, it deals with the last couple of moments of Polycarp's life. And I want to read it to you and just hear the parallels between Polycarp's story and between so many stories that we hear in the New Testament. Polycarp finds himself in this arena. The stadium is full. They are ready to kill him. And he is brought before this proconsul and asked to deny Christ. The proconsul says to him, have respect for your age. He's 86, right? There is this kind of feeling in the crowd that nobody really wants to see an 86-year-old man burned at the stake. Right? So they're thinking, if we can just get this old man, maybe he's a bit infirm in his thinking. If we can just get him to deny Jesus, we can all kind of not have to see what's going to happen. So the proconsul comes forward and he says to Polycarp, have respect for your age. And other related things they customarily say. They ask him to say, swear by the fortune of Caesar. Repent. Say, away with the atheists. But Polycarp looked with a stern face at the entire crowd of lawless people in the stadium. And gesturing to them with his hands, he sighed, looked up to heaven and said, away with the atheists. So Polycarp turns the tables on them and calls the crowd the atheists rather than the Christians. The proconsul became more insistent and said, take the oath and I will release you. Revile Christ. But Polycarp responded, and this is one of my favorite lines in Christian history. As far as it goes, I don't think they get much better than this. Polycarp responded, for 86 years I have served him, and he has done me no wrong. How can I blaspheme my king who has saved me? But the proconsul persisted and said, swear by the fortune of Caesar. And Polycarp answered, if you are so foolish as to think that I will swear by the fortune of Caesar, as you say, and if you pretend not to know who I am, listen closely. I am a Christian. Polycarp is led away to the stake, and the tradition says, and if you read the rest of the story, the tradition says that they tied him to the stake and set fire to the pyre that was built beneath him, and the flames leapt up and surrounded Polycarp, but didn't burn him, to the extent that one of the Roman soldiers had to stab him through the flames in order to bring him to his death. And the crowd were deeply moved, and the proconsul realized that Polycarp's faith in life had actually extended beyond that and was beginning to influence people even through his death. But as I read this story and I read these words, for 86 years I have served him and he has done me no wrong. How can I blaspheme my king who has saved me? I don't know about you, but I read a line like that from an elderly man facing his death when a couple of simple words would get him out of there and home to safety. And yet he chooses his loyalty and his trust in Jesus over his own life. Which kind of makes me ask this question of myself. Where's my line of compromise? It's kind of unlikely that those of us in this room will ever face the sort of questions that Polycarp asks with the threat of our life. Not impossible. There are many places in the world that you could find yourself that a question like that might get you in a lot of trouble. But all of us would also admit to the fact that our own lives are worked out in a society, in a context where we have to make decisions over our faith on a pretty regular basis. Maybe they're not life and death decisions, but they're still decisions. Do you say that? Do you do that? Do you go with that? Do you stand up for that? Do you let that go? Your life on a day-to-day basis forces you to make choices. And sometimes, I think, if I'm honest, and if you're honest, you'll realize that sometimes we make those choices, and our faith in Christ is not always the strongest driving factor in why we make some of the choices that we make. And then we read stories of people who stood before emperors and kings and said, I'm only going to do one thing, and it's what God has called me to do. Over the course of this series, you'll hear about other people of faith, other people who stood loyal to God, other people who actually decided that although society was drawing them to live one way, they were being drawn to live another way. And they were being drawn by their trust in God. And hopefully what will happen over the course of this series is we hear these stories, like the stories of these brothers in the Maccabees, or like the story of Polycarp. It will inspire something in us to think about our own faith. I sometimes wonder if I need to do like a compromise audit. That, maybe I need to go through my life and actually just from time to time spot, like, where are the bits of my life that maybe I'm not as loyal to Jesus as I should be? Where are the moments in my life where actually the question, how do I best follow Jesus in this situation, maybe comes to me afterwards, but not straight away? When I read the story of Polycarp, I often like to think to myself, what would I do in that story? You can look Polycarp's death up on the internet and read about yourself, but maybe that's the question you should ask over the course of this series. As you hear about all these different unsung heroes of our faith, let's ask ourselves the question, and what would I do if that was me? And maybe as we look around our situations of our day-to-day life, we'll start to see that there are moments in our lives that question is always applicable. Decisions that we make on a day-to-day basis, how we are at our work, the things we invest our time into, our language, our attitudes, our behaviors, all of these things we can look at and hear from these heroes of our faith and think, maybe there's new ways that I can be. You see, because what you'll find as we tell you the stories over the next few weeks is these heroes that make it into Hebrews 11 and other heroes of our Christian story that we tell, they seem to be marked by a particular brand of faith. A faith that doesn't require everything to be okay in order to practice it. A faith that doesn't say, hey, God, I'll believe in you as long as it all works out fine for me. But rather, you'll be drawn and encouraged by these heroes of Christianity into a way of looking at things which says, do you know, I'm going to trust in God regardless of what happens. I'm going to believe that on God's eternal perspective, he can make all things right. But my first responsibility as a follower of Jesus is just to follow him, to work out my own faith in him in my day-to-day existence. Because see, faith isn't faith if it only works when things go well. Faith is faith when you find yourself in the lion's den and don't know how it's going to end up. Faith is faith when you're facing down an emperor and he's asking you whether you believe in Jesus or not, and you say yes and trust God regardless of the outcome. See, because faith isn't in everything being okay for you, but faith, as Hebrews tells it, is a faith in a God who raises the dead. Which, of course, always reminds us of Jesus and reminds us that the God who can take Jesus through death and back up the other side into resurrection is the same God that we follow today. The Jesus who has lived and died reminds us that God is working on a bigger scale and a bigger perspective than we always see. Which perhaps is why, right at the beginning of Hebrews 11, the writer puts it like this. Faith is confidence in what we hope for and assurance about what we do not see. And I think sometimes we'd like it if faith was confidence that what we want to happen will happen. But actually the writer starts to tell you a story that says what you're hoping for is that the God who raises the dead can still protect you on an eternal scale. But our confidence in God is that God is always with us, regardless of what goes on in our life. And I don't know where you are in your life and situation at the moment. Maybe you're in a great time of life and everything's awesome, or maybe you're in a really difficult time of life. And faith isn't colored by whether you're having a good time or a bad time. Faith is trusting that God is with you regardless of what's going on and regardless of how it works out. We sang a song right at the opening today, and I just want to finish with this song echoing again in our mind. The words said that Christ is before me and Christ is behind me. These words come from an old prayer of St. Patrick. And St. Patrick, basically, he worked out his prayer. He said, Christ is with me, Christ is before me, Christ is behind me, Christ is in me, Christ is beneath me. And his prayer was basically to remind us that what's going on around about us, what's happening in our lives might be difficult, might be hard, might not make sense. Sometimes the most difficult thing about living out life isn't that it's good times and it's bad times. It's that we just don't know what's happening. We just don't know what's going to happen next. And the constant call of the heroes of the Bible, the call of the people we'll talk about over the next few weeks, is you'll never know what's going to happen next. But what you can know is that God is trustworthy. That if you put your faith in him and if you trust in him, he will lead you through and he will be with you. That's the biblical promise, that God is with you and that God will always be with you. So I'd love to pray for you as we start this series and as you go ahead and head home this week. I'd love to pray for you using St. Patrick's words. So if you bow your heads, let us pray together. St. Patrick said it like this: Christ with me, Christ before me. Christ behind me, Christ in me. Christ beneath me, Christ above me. Christ on my right, Christ on my left. Christ when I lie down, Christ when I sit down, Christ when I arise. Christ in the heart of every man who thinks of me, Christ in the mouth of everyone who speaks of me, Christ in every eye that sees me, and Christ in every ear that hears me. So may you in your journey, whatever it is that you're facing, the difficult, the enjoyable, or just the unknown, may your faith in God be strong. May your trust in Christ be the first thing in your life. And may you find the Christ that is all around you, sustaining you so that you can keep following him, regardless of the situation you're in. Amen. May God's grace and peace be on you this week.